Hello ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to today's webinar, which is brought to you by Shared Services Link. My name is Susie West and I am your presenter for today. And what we're going to be discussing today is very much the role and responsibilities of a new, relatively new job title of Global Process Owner, and the responsibilities and the roles of the Global Process Owner. I say it's relatively new. Nominally it is a relatively new term, probably being used or adopted by the mainstream, you could say, in the last 1, maybe 2 years. It is actually a role that's been around, certainly in shared services, for 5, 6, in some companies up to 10 years, but often under a different name. And although it is something that is being rolled out across a lot of shared services organisations now, there is still quite a few questions which have been unanswered about what the role entails, what kind of authority the individual should have, who the individual should be reporting into, etc. So the essence of today's webinar is to really provide some answers to those questions, and the information that we're using to provide those answers comes from a session that Shared Services Link ran and chaired and hosted back in February of this year in London, which was the bringing together of 33 GPOs, either existing GPOs or aspiring GPOs, to really discuss what the role of a GPO was, what their responsibility should be, what does a successful GPO need to kind of look like, sound like, behave like in order to drive through change. And that day came together and was a very useful day. 33 individuals there from companies like Balfour Beatty, GlaxoSmithKline, Tesco's, Serco, etc. So very, very large organisations. And we were gathering together information to really condense into a document. And that document had and has 2 purposes. We refer to the document as the Global Process Owners Manual, and it is to serve as a guideline to individuals and companies who are looking to either develop a GPO role or implement it for the first time. So that's objective number 1. Objective number 2 is for the document to be used as a tool. And this is actually, I put it in second place, but you could almost share first place in the listing. It's to be used as a tool because sometimes the biggest stumbling block for a GPO is resistance from senior management, because they don't quite understand what the role involves and what it should entail and what it should look like and what power the GPO should have, or influence or authority, call it what you will. So this document was again put together to serve as a tool to put in front of senior management, senior leadership team, to say this is what a GPO really needs in order to be successful in the organisation. So we are going to, or I am going to be looking at some of the key findings from that one day in February in London, and obviously the connection with the manual, going to be looking at the key findings from that manual as well. Okay, let's have a look at the first part of what the session looked at back in February, and that really was to identify the mission of the role, and getting 33 people in the room to agree on what the mission, or to agree on anything, is actually quite a challenge in itself. So, but there was a general consensus to what the mission of the role is, and ultimately the role of a GPO, it was agreed that the GPO should be the owner of the process design and process deployment, and be the owner of that process from end to end. And the purpose of their focusing on this was ultimately to help the company meet and exceed its performance targets. There was a bit of debate around what end-to-end actually means. There was conversation suggesting that end-to-end would actually start at the beginning of the birth of that transaction and end at the end of that transaction, or the death of that transaction. With the example purchase to pay, we would be looking at a process owner owning the process from the raising of purchase orders, and maybe even before that, right the way through to the payment of the transaction. And that, of course, straddles 2 functions, so procurement and finance. There was also an argument from some people in the room, and I know that there are other organisations who also support this, which is to look at end-to-end within a function. So I was talking at a recent event with one of the GPOs at Oracle, and they very much operate their process ownership within accounts payable. So the scope of it seems to be kind of cross-function, but doesn't necessarily have to be. And for those companies that don't necessarily have process ownership from a cross-functional perspective, and do look to have ownership operating end-to-end but within function, i.e. accounts payable, it's kind of generally considered that there's a team of GPOs, and there's a GPO for one part of the function and a GPO for another function. They really work in collaboration, they really work as a team, and they're really reporting into a single person. So the scope of it is something to be discussed, but the leaning is more towards kind of cross-functional. And obviously there's a G in it, which stands for global. So if you are a global organization, then one would assume that your GPO, your process owner, would have global remit, and all the processes that sit within the GPO's process are within their scope and within their ownership. So moving on and looking at the responsibilities, it's tied into the mission of the role, and looking at the responsibilities on this page in front of you now, you can see we really segregate it into three main areas. We worked with an organisation in the last few months on a survey and a study specifically on purchase to pay process ownership, and we wanted to find out to what degree the statement which we thought defined global process ownership resonated with respondents. And that statement really was around global process owners owning the process end to end, and any changes happening within that process, be behavioural changes or system changes, and that should there be any change within their process, that the global process owner needed to provide permission. So that's looking at it from a very kind of pure perspective and simple perspective, or high level perspective. You could say that that is the kind of the overall essence of a GPO, and over 90% of the audience that we asked agreed with that statement, reflecting the role. So drilling down into responsibilities, as I mentioned, we really kind of zeroed in on three areas of responsibilities. And again, bearing in mind this is a guideline document, and we chose to kind of zero in on three main areas. The first one, really looking at process design, including process mapping, process monitoring and process improvement. And that absolutely started with the GPO to map out the process, be really clear on defining what the required process looks like. Maybe it is the existing process, just a kind of a refreshing of what that current process is, and a refreshing of how people need to be responding to that current process. Being really clear about the areas for improvement, and the areas for waste, the areas for opportunity, and then actually project planning the implementation of those improvement programs, those improvement initiatives, and then monitoring and measuring those initiatives and making sure that everyone that needs to be up to speed on those particular initiatives in terms of reporting lines are up to speed. So that really was the first area. The second area involved very much change management, or does involve change management, and this is such a big meaty area, and really I think everyone on that day came away thinking that pretty much every activity that's actually involved in the GPO role somehow is connected to the subject of change management. And what we're really looking at here is the change management upwards, and obviously the change management sideways and downwards. And we're looking really at the communication upwards to stakeholder engagement. And I think this is the really key talking point, and we'll come on to it a little bit later when we talk about the kind of characteristics and the authority. It keeps coming up, the stakeholder engagement topic, but communicating to your peers or to the leadership team, to people that really need to get behind this, is obviously key. So it's just a case of how is that done. And in order to make sure it is done effectively, obviously being able to speak their language rather than a very kind of process-heavy language is key, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. So the responsibilities of being able to manage change upwards, and that means getting the buy-in from your leadership team or your stakeholders educating them on why the GPO role is so important, why all the changes that a GPO is overseeing are so important to the organisation, and helping the organisation actually get to the place that it wants to get to in the next 6 or 12 months. So that upward communication is obviously key, and you could say, we can choose another word, but one word I like to use for it is, you could say there's quite a lot of selling involved in that communication, because ultimately what you're doing is getting buy-in, so there ultimately is a little bit of sales involved there. And we've got training here as well, so training the organisation, training the trainers, training the users on what the process is, how they need to be working with the process to get the most out of the process, to be compliant with the process, educating them and training them on any systems changes or process changes, etc. And then moving on to the third point, you could say that this has got quite a heavy change management component in it itself, but we look to separate that out as a third area, which is to monitor user compliance. And this is obviously to have a really wide view on how your users are following the process, and being able to track compliance, and really being able to zero in on where compliance isn't happening, why isn't it happening, are there repeat patterns of behaviour or non-compliance, is it because there's a systems fault, or what is the actual reason for non-compliance. But to having that kind of that wide lens on your users and the compliance, and not just being aware as well of how you report on that. Is it through league tables? If so, are those league tables, did they rank everybody, or also all the kind of the key businesses as far as compliance is concerned? Is that report or that league table seen by the most senior people in the organisation, etc., etc. So there's the wide lens on the tracking of compliance, and also the kind of the reporting of that compliance as well. Really importantly, if I can just ask you to cast your eye down to the bottom paragraph, I'm often asked whether or not a GPO should actually be involved in the day-to-day operations, and my response is they should not. The improvement of a process is a huge and monumental task in its own right, especially when we're talking about large shared services organisations that often represent very large enterprises. And to look to do that and manage the actual day-to-day function or activity or process itself is a stretch, and it's going to probably lead to one of the areas suffering. So separating it out so that a GPO is not involved in the day-to-day and is absolutely spared functional responsibility, I think is very important. Going back to February when we all gathered together, the 33 GPOs, it was generally deemed that that seemed the sensible view. Let's now have a look at what does role success actually look like. I think that one of the key points to this actual topic is success will change company to company, and is there an actual kind of baked-in view of what success looks like for a GPO? And there's a huge overlap, and one company's view of success for a GPO's role will be very similar to the next one. I think the main takeaway from this is to have a clear view of what success looks like for you. So really defining that right from the start. And I think when GPOs move into their roles, or even right now if you haven't already done it, is to sit down with key people and key influencers in the organisation and say, okay, so if I'm going to be successful at my role, what does that look like? What does it look like to you? What does it look like to the business? And how can you tell that I have managed to be successful, that I have got there? So actually having that documented, it will just help you have the support that you need to. It's a good tool for you to be referring back to. If you're ever feeling that something's kind of moving off track, you can always refer back to that event and that document and say, look, we did put our heads together, we did say that this is what success should be looking like, and I feel like I don't have the support right now that I need to in order to meet that success. So can we perhaps just brainstorm a few ideas as to how we can get back on that track, or we need to maybe just check in and reevaluate what success actually looks like but it's a good document. You can call it a success document, call it what you want, but it's a good document that just serves as a check and balance as to the direction that a GPO is moving in, and those that support the GPO are also moving in. So we looked at the success of a GPO being very much plugged into where the company was going, what the company wanted to do in terms of, was it looking to expand, was it looking to increase its margins, mainly through cost reduction, what was the overall strategic objective of the business, did it need to really bolster its cash reserves because it wants to buy organizations in Latin America. So being aware of what that strategic direction is, so that ultimately plugs into the direction of a GPO, and then things kind of cascade down from there. And that does mean that the GPO does really need to be a senior individual who is linked into senior people in the organization. He or she knows the strategic objective of the organization. Outside that, we obviously listed more practical features that represent success. We've got 7 listed here, and I won't be going through all of them, but some features of success might include, for example, the establishment or the development or the tightening up of a governance model or a framework. And that's really just putting something in place that sees that a GPO can be effective. So again, having 33 companies in the room, are you going to have an agreement on should this be mandated, or should the change that a GPO issues be mandated? Should it just be kind of put out there and there's a hope that people adopt it? What should the response be, or what should the management of a GPO role look like in terms of its sway or its authority? And however, companies' cultures change company to company, and some companies are comfortable with mandating and some companies aren't. So it's a cultural fit. Also, I think it's really important to note this will depend on where you are in the maturity cycle, not just how long you've had a GPO, but how long you've had shared services, for example. Does the rest of your organization naturally buy into what your shared services does, and therefore, are they naturally kind of collaborating with the shared services, and therefore there's this idea that they would naturally collaborate with a GPO. So it will change company to company, but at least being wholly aware of that context and then building a governance model within that context that will help you implement any changes that you need to, or just see that the users are compliant with the process. Obviously, establishing a baseline is really, really vital, and that largely comes down to a lot of process mapping and understanding your as-is, and really then, and all the key performance metrics that come out of that, your cost per transaction, your timeliness on the transaction, the visibility that's available there, etc. And then obviously wanting to be clear as to what your as-will-be process will be looking like. Looking at number 4, another feature of success was to be recognised within and across the organisation as the go-to expert and owner of the process. So this means that the GPO is absolutely part of all the debates around process design, and no process change happens without the GPO say so. And I think this is really, really key. I mean, I think everyone was in agreement that there's not a lot of point having a process owner if people can make changes to your process without your say-so. It just doesn't seem to make sense. It just kind of questions the role of a GPO in the first place. So making sure that people know that you're the go-to person, and that might mean a little bit of advertising of your role to the organisation so they know who to go to and they know why to go to you. And obviously seeing that the business is, looking at number 6, seeing that the business is compliant with your processes, and we talked a little bit about that earlier. Most organisations that we worked with in February, they of course were keen to have a standardised process and move to, ideally, let's have one good process, and then anything that's not the good process is a bad process, and we'll look to reduce that as time goes on. And people in the room were generally in agreement that there should be a desired process it's as standardised as possible globally, but that there is an appreciation that flexibility might need to be built into it. Some people also say, look, there's a standard global process, we will only accept any kind of deviation from this process if you can show me a document which comes from an actual legal authority or an authority that stipulates that we should be following another process, and if you can show me that document, we will allow for a different process. If you can't show me that document, you need to follow this process. There might also be various systems that you're using, again, which means that a standard process might not always be possible, but this is generally what people are striving for. So looking at the impact on the business, the impact is huge. It's a little bit too early in the game to be actually providing hard metrics, but the sense is that it's huge. There's a big financial impact. So long as this role is done correctly, there's a big financial impact. It's not just on the back office functions. There's simplifying and streamlining processes. Obviously the GPO has huge direct impact on cost reduction areas right across the business. And the visibility impact is significant as well. The provision, because of this role and obviously because of a lot of other initiatives that normally go around this role, there have been a lot of projects in place to move to better visibility, and that means being able to have access to more accurate data in a much more timely fashion. It's upfront rather than downstream. It's readily available, readily accessible, and it's absolutely there to fuel agile decision making. And often we see, I mentioned earlier, the GPO straddling functions, working very closely with the business, with the outsourcer, with the shared services. So you've got this much tighter sense of collaboration and a clearer view on innovative things that need to be done. Looking at the authority of a GPO, and I think this is a key talking point, in order for a GPO to be successful, they need to convey real authority, they need to be a strong personality, they need to probably have figured out how the organisation works, who the key influences actually are. They need to be an individual that the rest of the organisation takes seriously. So this is somebody with clout. Some people say they need teeth, they need to have the teeth to go and drive through the change that is needed. They also do need to have the support from the senior executive team, and support comes in many different shapes and sizes. What we're talking about here is explicit support from senior executive team, so that users generally don't have an idea of undermining a GPO. So there's a little bit of a campaign that needs to take place there, and a conversation to actually be had with the senior executive team along the lines of, you've been involved in the building of the success document and this has been absolutely instrumental, and you can hold me to account as far as this success document is concerned, because I'm signing it off and you're signing it off. In order to be successful, one of the kind of criteria of success is for you to explicitly support the role of the GPO. And once that explicit support has been provided, it should make things more straightforward for you. And also just having that route to the executive level as far as any kind of escalation is needed, the senior team knowing that you will be calling on them if needed, just to, again, kind of get involved to drive through a change that might be well needed. It's useful for you to have an ambassador, a network of ambassadors for change, or ambassadors of change rather, across the organisation. And this is either a formal arrangement or an informal arrangement, but these are people that you can call on to really help spread the message. And you might find that as a GPO you'll be sitting on a governance board or a change board. And again, that you'll be working closely with people who drive change and are very, very familiar with how change happens in your organisation. Looking at budget, so budget is a key part of a GPO's world. And again, you could say that a GPO just absolutely has to have their own budget in order to get things done. And I don't think many people would argue with you. If you don't have any budget, then there won't be too much change or too much improvement happening. The secondary way of looking at it is, if you don't have your budget, then having access to a budget and having a clear and predictable path to that budget, so you know what you need to do in order to get access to that budget. You need to build a business case, you need to put it to these people, it will be signed off in these time frames, and so it's a predictable pattern. It's not a surprise every single time, and it's not a different process every single time. But most individuals at the event in London were very keen on the idea of just having their own budget. It was also quite interesting to talk about ROI. Some people were saying that stuff would absolutely just not be signed off if it didn't have an ROI within 2 years, and other people were saying that the GPO needs to be allowed to invest in things that might not have an ROI for 5 years. So again, it's an important conversation to be had. So looking at the relationship that a GPO has with IT, this is another important talking point. So this is the third paragraph down. The relationship between a GPO and IT can sometimes be quite tense, and that's because a GPO will ultimately want to decide that certain tools and applications and bolt-on technologies are required in their process in order to be successful. And yet the IT department might see these tools and technologies as their domain, and they might want to be building the RFP. They might want to be interviewing or tendering the service providers. They actually might want to make the final selection. So you sometimes have this kind of fight between the GPO and the IT department. And this is something that ultimately needs to be addressed. Some companies really have an issue with it, and other companies it's not an issue at all. IT and the GPO really work beautifully together. So it would depend on the history of these departments working together, or Department of Shared Services, or Finance, or IT working together. So but making sure that there's an elegance in that relationship is absolutely key. I think looking at it from my perspective, my view is that the GPO should be ultimately owning the investment on bolt-on applications and tools that actually affect their process. So they should be building the RFP document, they should be meeting with all the providers, and they should be critical in the sign-off of the final provider that they go with. And IT should have a role in there, kind of sit on their committee, if you will, and sit on their committee when it comes to things like security and how it liaises with their ERP. So however you end up doing it, it's something to be looked at, early on. And again, that can be something that's kind of discussed in your success meeting. What does success look like? This is the meeting that we talked about earlier. The success meeting that you have with your senior team to define what success looks like, and then the tools that you need to have in place in order to be successful. And one of those tools might be the relationship with IT. How does it work? What's your sign-off remit going to be? What's their sign-off remit going to be? Who's going to have the last word, etc. Okay, let's move on. We've got a couple of moments to really look at the characteristics and skills. So in terms of the characteristics and skills, see here that it is absolutely critical to this role that the GPO is listened to and is followed and is respected. So this does kind of beg the question of what's the perfect kind of GPO? What does he, she look like? What background do they have? Where did they come from? Have they been in the business itself, out in the business? Have they been mainly in finance? Do they have senior management experience, etc.? So it just kind of starts asking all those questions. And these were, in pretty much this order, these were the traits that we ended up kind of zeroing in on. The first one was having strong process knowledge. So you don't need to be the subject matter expert, but you do need to have subject matter expertise. It helps. It will help give you respect where it's needed. And being aware as to how to do process mapping, for example, and having had training on all of that, and being experienced in all of that. The second one, the connections with key influencers, is key. And I think we kept coming back to this as a topic. We kept revisiting it again and again during our session in February, and it was very much about, it almost made it quite political. It's like, who do you know? Who are the influencers that you know? How well are you engaged with the key stakeholders? What's your relationship with the key stakeholders? Do you have an alliance with the key influencers in the organisation? Do you know who they are? Do you know where they sit? Why are they going to listen to you, etc., etc.? So you have to kind of almost put together a campaign of identifying who the key influencers are, and then how are you going to message with them? How are you going to get them excited about what you're doing? When you go to speak their language, what language is that? What's resonating with them right now? What's critical for them right now? So understanding all of this, and then positioning any kind of process improvement as something that will absolutely help them with their needs and assist their needs and meet their objectives is an advisable way forward. An individual that, from a personality perspective, that looks to move into being a GPO or build on being a GPO is having strong change management skills, and that is largely because a GPO is basically asking people in the organisation to potentially change their habits in order for the process change to come into play and to be successful. So for a GPO to be successful, they need to be excellent at change management. And that's really knowing when to draw on the carrot, when to draw on the stick, etc. And change management it's not often done just by one person. You need to have people around you that support you and help ensure that you will not be undermined. So having strong change management in your toolkit will ultimately help. Having strong communication skills, and what we basically mean by that again is you could say that kind of is connected so tightly with change management, and it really just boils down to, again, being able to speak the language of the stakeholders. So it's not telling people what is important about the role, it's really understanding what's important to the people around you, the stakeholders, and then positioning the GPO's role as something that can absolutely help assist them be successful in their role. So you can see how we're really calling on some sales skills as well coming into play here. Having business knowledge is key. So you could say, again, so is this individual going to come from the process itself, or is that person going to have had that process knowledge, but they maybe have come from another part of the business? They might be a blend of having had senior management experience. They might be an accountant, they might not be. They might have had experience in procurement. They may have had some kind of background in IT. So we're looking at a blended individual, somebody that hasn't necessarily kind of followed a single track in terms of their career. So having all-rounded business knowledge is useful. I like to refer to it as having just really strong business acumen, so that you can really communicate how your process fits into the wider business, and you can communicate that really eloquently. And also having project management skills, we talked about earlier, that one of the responsibilities is obviously identifying where these improvements are going to come from and then instigating projects to realise those improvements. So having project management skills is really very key to being a successful GPO. And having people management skills, and you could say, well, is this people management up, down, sideways, how does it go? People skills generally, where you're managing your stakeholders, your peers, your boss, your reports, partners like IT, partners like outsourcers, partners like your shared services organisation. All these kind of people management skills are really, really key. So much of this is about the communication bit, the people bit, rather than, you could say, actually, perhaps more than the kind of the process piece itself. It's much more about the people piece, because you need the people to follow the process rules in order for this to all be successful. So actually just drawing on that, I think it's important to, again, to specify that if the GPO has characteristics like integrity, likability, reliability, tenacity, they may or may not be popular. You know, there's a lot of change happening here. It helps if they are popular, but having really good, solid characteristics will certainly help. And then looking at IT skills is we're starting to kind of creep down to the bottom of the list here. Some people argue that IT skills are really important. Others were less excited by the idea of having IT skills at the top of their must-have list. A lot of people have a lot of IT skills when it comes to usability. We've all got mobile devices. We all know from a functionality perspective what we do like, what we don't like. We all have a sense of understanding as to what motivates us to use a certain technology and what doesn't. So actually, most of us in the workplace have a good degree, a strong degree of IT skills anyway, but what we might not have is we might not be able to put code together, and we might not have been involved in the ERP and implementation. I think the general consensus is that it doesn't matter. It's really how can you put together a tool set in your process that's going to encourage people to use it, and leaving the other bits and bobs, the coding, the installation, the upgrades, the security to your IT team, but making sure that you've got a great relationship with them. And then finally, coming in at sales skills, My background is sales, so I'm a big kind of advocate of positioning sales as what's critical to securing buy-in, and call it what you want. It might be kind of more of looking at it as communication or people management skills. I like to think of it as sales skills. You're going out there, you're selling a vision, you're getting people excited about what it is you're doing, you're listening to them and what's important to them, and positioning your role in their context. And that really is a key kind of sales approach there. Let's conclude with that obviously the GPO role is being more widely adopted, especially by larger enterprises. And what we've walked you through here is some of the areas, the key areas for you to be successful in your deployment of the GPO. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and we will be sharing these slides with you over the next couple of days, and good luck in your GPO ventures, and we look forward to welcoming you next time. Goodbye.